Hi, I'm Pat Horn from South Africa. I work for WeGo, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, with a focus on collective bargaining in the informal economy. So in 2002, where we did succeed in getting a good definition of own account work in Clause 4 of the Resolution on Decent Work in the Informal Economy, we've basically tried to ensure that we get more of consciousness among the trade union movement about own account workers, because sometimes that's been what's made it difficult for them to relate to workers in the informal economy. So the Self-Employed Women's Association in India, SEVA, most of its members are own account workers, and they've been very clear that they have a union for workers, and it doesn't require having employers. The union for workers is to resolve problems of the workers, and it's not necessarily something which mediates between employers and employees. Uh, we've discovered that there's more of a mental block in Anglophone countries about own account work. Uh, it seems to have something to do with English speaking lawyers who think that you have to use the word employees whenever you have legal instruments about workers. They've got a mental block against using the word workers. If you use the word workers, it can apply to all workers, including own account. In French speaking countries, Spanish speaking, and Portuguese speaking countries, you get them using the word workers as the basis for the legislation, and the legislation's often more open. In Spain, there's a whole body of legislation about autonomous work. There's an autonomous workers union. There's an autonomous workers bargaining council, which basically gives access to collective bargaining. But for some reason that I don't completely understand, uh, it's very difficult to get acknowledgement of that in Anglophone countries, and hence there's much less coverage of own account workers in law in Anglophone countries than there is in countries in those languages, particularly in the global south. So own account workers can organize, and there's many organizations of own account workers. They've become well known. Seva in India is a really good example. Um, but actually, moving from organizing to collective bargaining becomes problematic if the countries have been resistant to adopting policies and legal protections for own account workers. And one of the difficulties is that in the formal trade union movement, and also reinforced by the ILO Convention on Collective Bargaining, the definition of collective bargain is extremely narrow. The definition says that it's negotiations between employers and employees. Now, in principle, collective bargaining should be able to happen between any workers who are controlled by or dependent on somebody else. That person could be an employer, but it could be somebody else. With own account workers, they're also dependent either on local governments or on suppliers sometimes, or on intermediaries, or any range of other people who are not employers, which makes them suffer the same kind of exploitation that employed workers suffer. In the case of the employed workers, they suffer their exploitation more routinely from employers. So this uh, obstacle has made it difficult for collective bargaining to be recognized, in which workers in the informal economy can directly participate, and particularly own account workers. Very often, trade unionists who are sympathetic to workers in the informal economy and sympathetic to working together with them think that the best way they can be of assistance is to go and negotiate on behalf of workers in the informal economy. The problem is that if they don't know very much about own account work, they're not well placed to negotiate for own account workers. And they themselves, wouldn't like other people to negotiate on their behalf. And hence the motto that we have, nothing for us without us. What we try to say to the trade unionists is, if you really support the concept of collective bargaining in the informal economy, including collective bargaining by workers who are own account workers, what you should be doing is clearing space for own account workers to participate, not offering to go and negotiate on their behalf. So there's a lot of work that we've had to do with the trade unions themselves, with very good intentions, but with a patronizing approach, to get them to really, really realize that, you need to talk to your partners in these institutions, that space needs to be made for workers in the informal economy to represent themselves through their own elected representatives. And this is something which isn't resolved. We sometimes get trade unionists to come to our negotiation skills training. They meet a whole lot of people in the sector and they start to understand from their point of view, and then they start to get the idea. But a lot of the trade unionists don't have time to do that. They think that if they make some nice patronizing statements about, yes, we're going to help these guys, they're really suffering a lot, they think they've done their bit. But in fact, it's not, it's not helping that much. So there's been a lot of progress in recognition of self-employed or own account workers. There's still a resistance to covering them properly by law and policy. There was even a bit of a regression in the wording in Recommendation 204, which talks about own account workers in a rather a confusing way, because it's not clear when they talk about own account workers there whether they're talking about them as economic units or actually as workers. So I don't think that the language in Recommendation 204 is sufficiently reinforcing of the concept of own account, although own account workers are certainly mentioned there. But the main obstacle is getting through to collective bargaining. Now, the issue is that the traditional institutions of collective bargaining are not particularly suitable for different kinds of employment relationships, and particularly own account workers. So what's needed to be looked at is new kinds of institutions, innovative institutions. Quite a few things have happened. In India, as a result of a long struggle for a policy on street vendors, 2014, a very good federal law was passed on protection of livelihoods and regulation of street vending act. And in that law, there's provision for a collective bargaining structure at local government level called town vending committees. And the town vending committees, which are now an obligation by municipalities in India, are where there's a structure which 50% would come from street vendors, leaders, and NGOs like human rights NGOs, including migrants NGOs and so on. The other 50% is a combination of local government officials and the private sector, being shop owners and the private sector in cities. And the town vending committees are a structure at local government level which fulfill the requirement of direct participation in collective bargaining by workers in that particular sector of the informal economy. There are not too many of those kinds of examples, but it's a best practice that one can work towards. And in practice, what we've been doing over all of these years is training street vendors and informal traders in how to be negotiators, so that they can also then push for negotiating forums to be set up at local government level, because a lot of the policy that are most impactful on the actual workplace and working conditions are determined at local government level. We're still not very far advanced, actually, in exercising the right to collective bargaining, even though we have these loose commitments to the fact that everybody has the right. But then to realize that right, we haven't got far. We still have resistance from our own allies in the labor movement, particularly the ones from the global north, but not exclusively from the global north. More industrialized countries in the global south too have been less supportive. In Africa, in South Africa, it's very difficult for us to get that. In West Africa, where there's a lot of unionization of workers in the informal economy, it's not such an obstacle. The ILO model is the tripartite model, and unless the workers or the labor sector of the tripartite model opens its doors to workers in the informal economy, workers in the informal economy remain shut out there. And this is where we hit these problems of trade union federations saying, no, we can just represent all of you on your behalf. We'll speak about you in your absence. And so we haven't really broke through much there. And in all of the instruments that have been determined since we made the breakthrough on own account workers in 2002, there have been attempts to make breakthroughs because there's usually been a statement somewhere in any instrument, the instrument on social protection floors, the instrument on the Convention on domestic workers. Every instrument talks about the fact that workers in the informal economy have the right to collective bargaining, have equal rights to collective bargaining, but then there's an obstacle as to how they're supposed to do it, because what it does is to focus on the tripartite structure. It's got sort of vague statements like the most representative unions, the most representative organizations. But in fact, both on the worker side as well as on the employer side, there's a lack of workers and economic units in the informal economy actually being at the negotiating table. And we have not cracked that one. Now, there's been a recurrent discussion on social dialogue and tripartism. And there's a really wonderful clause in that recurrent discussion which talks about the obligation of member states to put in place innovative structures precisely to make it possible for sectors of workers and economic units that have previously been excluded from collective bargaining to now be included. It's precisely to fill this gap that we are trying to do. The complication is that a clause in a resolution coming from a recurrent discussion can't trump a clause in a convention. And the convention has a horrible clause about collective bargaining only being between employers and employees. So it's a completely out of date situation, and hence it's very difficult to make progress, and particularly from the workers in the global north who find it hard to think outside of the box of the traditional tripartite structure. Tripartite plus structure is not the answer. Getting the labor sector to open its doors and bring in the different kinds of organizations of workers in the informal economy is the answer. Here at the international labor conferences, we do work with a tripartite structure because the representatives of workers in the informal economy are welcomed into the workers group and do negotiate as part of the workers group. So at the international level here, we do have that set up. We have that set up where we are right there. We have the same rights as workers from the formal economy to participate in the workers groups. We are taken very seriously in those workers groups. We especially when there's issues on informal work, we are normally regarded as the experts. So that's the kind of model one needs to have at country level. And in Senegal, they have an actual organization of the employers in the informal economy, and they have a seat in the tripartite body which exists in Senegal, the High Council of Social Dialogue. So this is still work in progress, and it needs a lot more work. It needs a lot more understanding of how these tripartite forums work. I don't think we're going to learn much from forums in the global north because they're still protecting the old way. But some of the ones developing, I've been watching what happens in West Africa because there's less resistance to unionization of own account workers in West Africa, in different countries, and the different countries in West Africa have different ways in which they do this. And therefore we've got many more workers in the informal economy in West Africa that do sit in these forums. Platform workers are what we call the new informal. Because of the fact that they get misclassified all over, employers and some governments try to, but mainly the employers, say that the people who are platform workers are not real workers because they're independent contractors and because they choose to like work with apps and so on. And then ignoring the elements of economic dependence that do exist there. And of course, that's being captured now in the discussion on platform work, so that the economic dependence of the platform workers and therefore the need for protection has been what's been brought to the fore. So the same obstacles to collective bargaining that we've been facing in different sectors that organize own account workers in the informal economy, the same obstacles are with us on the platform discussion. We have not overcome it. What's been happening is that in certain countries, certain models have been put in practice which get a little bit further than the collective bargaining convention takes us. So I heard last week from somebody from the International Alliance of App-Based Transport Workers. In New York, the taxi drivers union developed a system of collective bargaining. So it was very specific to the US. Localized examples have been developed where those sectors have been well organized. They're not protected by any laws, they're not protected by any frameworks. They've been set up because the sector is well organized. Just as we managed to get sometimes street vendors to get municipalities to negotiate with them de facto, but it's not supported by any law. As I say, the only one that is well supported is the one in India. Since we've been working on this in a fairly concentrated way for the past 30 years, we'll continue to regroup and fight on all fronts against the really unjustified continued exclusion of own account workers from the right in practice to direct involvement in collective bargaining. Fortunately, the changing world of work, which we are now in the midst of discussing through the Committee on Decent Work and the Platform Economy, and growing collective organization of workers in these new forms of work, is reinforcing this struggle. Amandla, a luta continua.